excited to listen to Professor Salil's talk today. And Professor Salil also does not need any introduction, but very briefly, Professor Salil Misra, he's an historian of modern India and studied at JNU for his master's and doctoral degree. His publications include a monograph on a narrative of communal politics, Uttar Pradesh, 1937 to 1939, and a booklet in Hindi on Swaraj Party, which was brought out by the National Book Trust. He has published articles on themes related to communal politics, language question, Hindi, Urdu, partition of India, social science teaching, and identity politics. During April-July 2009, he was a visiting researcher at the Center for History of Emotions, Max Planck Institute for Human Development, Berlin. Currently, he is Professor of History at the Ambedkar University, Delhi. And I would also like to add that his courses are very interesting around the partition of India. Many of my students attend these courses and they learn a lot from them. And in my personal meetings with him over these years, I've heard him recite Urdu poetry a number of times. And it's very impressive. I feel he's more a person who's from literature than from history. And we are really delighted that the talk today is a talk around literature.
Thank you, Diamond, Yogesh, friends, colleagues, students. Very happy that I've got this opportunity to talk on a theme on which I am very interested, not just as a historian, but as a consumer of Urdu literature. As I wrote in my note, I am assuming that I am speaking to an audience which is very interested in Urdu, but not so well informed. And therefore there is some justification in casting a view from the outside. Let's all become outsiders to Urdu and then look at it. It is not very easy because in some ways, particularly in North India, our lives do tend to be connected around Urdu literature. I mean, it has become so much a part of our literary and cultural lives. But let's for a minute look at it from the outside. As we look at it from the outside, my first contention or starting statement would be that we are dealing with something. When I talk about Urdu, we are dealing with something which is extremely atypical and unusual. It is atypical and unusual both as a language and as a literature. So the contention is that it's an extremely unusual kind of language and it's a very unusual kind of literature. And why do I say that? Firstly, language. Look at the name of the language, Urdu. This name Urdu is not derived from territory, as is the case with most Indian languages. Look at the names of Indian languages: Punjabi, Bengali, Marathi, Avdi, Braj, Bhojpuri, Gujarati. They are all region derivatives. The names have been derived from the name of the region. Not so Urdu. Nor is it derived from a community. Most of the languages of North India, Sino-Tibetan family of languages, there the names of the languages are community derived. Khasi, for instance. Urdu is not. Nor is it derived from a geography or a terrain like Malayalam. So it's the most unusual name for a language, derived neither from region, nor from territory, nor from community, nor from a kind of geography. It is also unusual because there was no Urdu speech community to talk of. Generally, we find in linguistic history that there are speech communities, and the speech communities, some of them evolve their own literature. Some evolve oral, some evolve written literature, which then reinforces the community and its boundary lines. In Urdu's case, there was no such Urdu community pre-existing in an a priori kind of manner. In fact, the case was that it was literature that created the community around it. So it's not a speech community creating literature, it's actually literature which then creates a community around it. That makes the language unusual. Urdu is also unusual because it's a kind of a created language, not an evolved language. It did not take many centuries, as is the case with many other languages and literatures, Braj, Awadhi, Gujarati and others. It was ready for deployment in a very short span of time, sometime in the 18th century. We can't really talk of an Urdu prior to the 18th century in the sense in which we understand Urdu today. And since the 19th century, it has not changed very much. So in a way, there is a short window, short time in which this language was there, it was created, and then it's been more or less like that. Its outer boundaries got created in a very short span of time, and since then they have not changed very much. So it would be true to say that it's a kind of a created language rather than an evolved language. And these are neutral terms. I mean, I'm using them in a descriptive kind of sense, not in any pejorative or prescriptive sense. Urdu was also unusual because it had no specific territory of its own. In that sense, Urdu was very similar to the one comparison I can think of is Sanskrit. It was somewhat like Sanskrit. But Sanskrit then was the language of sacred Hinduism, it was a language of Brahmins. But Urdu, we know, and I hope to demonstrate, Urdu was completely a-religious, non-religious, almost anti-religious, in fact quite heretical on the language, on the religious question, as I hope to show. So what was its region? Well, there are different accounts which give us very different regions. The most accepted, of course, is that there was a region around Delhi and Meerut where there was a particular speech community from which Urdu as a language grew. But if you look at records in Pakistan, it was the official language of Pakistan. They look at Punjab as the origin of Urdu. And that's for understandable reasons. In Pakistan, they did not want to believe that a language which was their official language actually had its region in Indian heartland. So they would rather put it as Pakistan. There is an argument that the language actually came from south, Deccan. There was a language Dakhni which either mutated or changed or reconfigured into Urdu. And for some, it's Gujarat, that there was a literature, Dakhni, Gujari, from which Urdu emerged. So Delhi, Madras, Punjab, Deccan, Gujarat, there is a kind of greyness there. So it is, for all these reasons, I would consider Urdu to be an unusual language. And it is an unusual language, very atypical, you would agree. Why is literature atypical? I said that not just the language, the literature, the poetry is also extremely unusual, almost unique and atypical. Initially, Urdu was the language of poetry. Not much prose was written in it. Till mid-19th century, you don't find much prose. It was the language primarily of poetry, though that's not very unusual. In fact, it's the norm for a large number of languages to develop poetry first and then prose. For a long time, for about half a century or more, it remained the language primarily of poetry. The form, the familiar term which is generally employed for Urdu poetry is ghazal. It's an Arabic word which means conversations. Not all Urdu poetry can be exhausted, can be reduced to ghazal. Ghazal is one of the many, but the most dominant during the mainstream period. But Urdu poetry for a long time and to outsiders has generally been equated with ghazal. Ghazal is Urdu. So if anything that's written in Urdu, any poetry, it's generally given the name ghazal, though it's not. Ghazal is a particularly unusual and atypical form of poetry. The ghazal, which is very strongly identified with Urdu and Urdu identified with ghazal, it consists of two-liners, couplets. Each couplet must tell a complete story. The meaning of one couplet or sher should not spill into another one. So each one should be absolutely independent, should stand on its own. Each couplet or sher should tell a complete story. And a ghazal will consist of 8 or 10 or 12 couplets or shers. A ghazal has no common theme. It has no title. You will never find a title for a ghazal. it will not have a heading, and it will not have a composite narrative or a story. Ghazal is not likely, there's not likely to be a story, single story or a composite story in a ghazal, in none of them. Within a ghazal, you can find two couplets which can actually contradict each other. And within the space of two lines, and it's okay, nobody from within the tradition is greatly offended by it, as we outsiders ought to be. Let me take an example. Urdu poetry, particularly under Khalid, which means the early part of the 19th century, it developed a very strange, a whole range of attitudes to the question of death. The attitude could be from lamenting to celebratory to what, a whole range of attitudes. Now I am reciting two shares or two couplets within the same ghazal in the space of two lines. First line would say, for instance, तेरे वादे पर जिए हम तो ये जान छूट जाना कि खुशी से मर न जाते अगर एतबार होता. If I had believed in your promise of meeting me, I would have died of happiness. I would have simply died of happiness. So important it was for me that you come and meet me. But as it happens, I am alive. I am not dead. And since I am alive, that proves that I didn't believe you. That is why I am alive. If I had believed you, I would be dead by now. And I would be dead through sheer joy at the thought of you agreeing to meet me. This is one line. In here, death is something to be celebrated, an absolute ultimate exaltation, the ultimate of things. And two lines later, or maybe in the next very line, Khalid would say, कहूँ किससे मैं कि क्या है, शब-ए गम बुरी बला है, मुझे क्या बुरा था मरना अगर एक बार होता. I am feeling bad not because of the fact that I have to die. Everyone has to die. The real tragedy of my life is that we die every moment. Every moment is a moment of death for us. Death is agony. Death is trauma. Now these are two completely contrasting, contradictory attitudes to love, to death. One in which it's celebrated, then the other one in which it's lamented. And what is being lamented? The fact that death is an everyday reality for us. We live as we die every moment. These are inconsistencies, but not only are these inconsistencies and contradictions accepted, they are actually celebrated within Urdu. They are not considered unusual. They are part of the decoration of Urdu Ghazal. Urdu Ghazal is decorated through these contradictions, through these inconsistencies. Ghalib, of course, is the master of this. Today I may not speak too much on him, but as far as the theme of attitude to death is concerned, there is no one else but Ghalib. The inventory or the usages of death, the meanings which are imparted to death have a great range, and I think Ghalib does not exhaust that range, he creates a range. The range did not exist before Ghalib, but he has created a whole range of attitudes and meanings that can be imparted to death. Because there is no single story or narrative in a ghazal, the narrative, the thematic base of Urdu ghazal is quite finite and restricted because there is no story. So it lives at a level of abstraction, and that abstraction tends to repeat itself in many ghazals. It's the thematic base is quite restricted. There would be very few themes which would be taken up in the ghazal, which are suitable to be taken up in the ghazal. Love, of course, religion, there is plenty of it, but a lot of it is sheer abstract philosophy. It seems that when there is no narrative, when there is no theme, philosophy fits in well. So philosophy has become a very important theme of mainstream Urdu poetry, Urdu ghazal. There are very few imageries because there are no stories, there are no individual characters, but there are cardboard characters, but they are also finite. You can count them on your fingertips. Let me just Ashik, Mashook, Raqiq, Qasid, Namabar, Saki, Rind, Pir Mughar, Rahbar, Sheikh, Nase, Zahid, Faiz, Hamdam, Hamsaya. These will constantly come again and again. And it is known that those people who are reading Urdu, they know the meanings. For instance, the Namabar is a letter carrier. But everybody is supposed to know that this letter carrier is not an honest or a straight letter carrier. He has an axe to grind. You are sending your message, he'll distort your message and carry a different message. This is not being told to you, but it's embedded, it's there. If you're reading in Urdu poetry, you're supposed to know it. Because somewhere or the other it would have been made clear. Now it's not going to be made clear. But you would appreciate the reference of Namabar when you know this background. So each character is a cardboard character, it's not an individual character, and each character has been imbued with certain traits, virtues and vices, and you are supposed to know them. Sheikh is a villain, he's a despicable, he's an undesirable character. Wise Nase is a preacher, a righteous preacher, and therefore he is to be constantly looked upon on. The creativity of Urdu Ghazal is what are the ways in which you look down upon the Nase. But you have to look down upon him. So there are villains, there are heroes, there are all kinds of characters, but they're all finite. And they keep coming in Urdu poetry. These characters, there is no father or mother or brother or just the parts of human life, part of lived life. You're not likely to find them. These characters that I talked about, they dot the entire landscape of Urdu Ghazal. So there is a finite base, but within a finite base, infinite possibilities are created in newer ways. Older things are being said in very new, very innovative kind of ways. That's the genius of the poet. The better way, the more creative way you say it in, the more you are more likely that you'll be recognized as a big poet. It's almost like a dictionary in which there are finite number of words, but what is constructed from that dictionary is actually infinite. Urdu has a dictionary of characters, of words, of people, of situations, of themes, and from that finite dictionary, they try and create all kinds of all kinds of situations, all kinds of possibilities. So at one level, Urdu poetry, particularly Ghazal, is all very, very repetitive. It's likely to be repetitive. Nobody minds that it is repetitive. It's expected to be repetitive. So when you read Urdu Ghazal, you get a feeling that you're reading something new, but you're also reading something which you would have read before. The character, the situations, the emotions, etc. As I said, all Urdu poetry is not exhausted by Ghazal, but I am dealing with the period, the mainstream period, 18th and mid-19th century, in which Ghazal was the dominant form, template. It was Urdu's USP, it was Urdu's main template. Urdu was known for its Ghazal, and Ghazal was an extremely, extremely unusual kind of a form, probably not found in other literary traditions. So what is the story of Urdu and some of the unusual things that I talked about at the beginning? Well, the story is very simple. In medieval times, Persian we know that it was not just the language of Persia, it was a language which was a fairly global or globalized language. In India, it was the language of administration, it was the language of official patronage, and since Akbar, it was also the language of a literary prestige. Many poets came from Persia, from Safavid Empire, they settled down in India, they got patronage, and Urdu and Persian then India probably became the second big center of Persian language, almost at par with Persia. There would be competitions in poetry, Malikul Shuara, every year it will be decided who is the big Persian poet. So a lot of the local people learned the language. They did not change their names, but they colored themselves, or they turned themselves into all kinds of hybrid Urdu poets. So during medieval times, you would come across the name of a poet whose names would be Gopal bin Govind, and this Gopal bin Govind would be a great Urdu poet who will try and become a Malikul Shuara. Now, at around the same time, around late 17th, early 18th century, late 17th century, there was a poet called Wali Dakni. He is considered the first big poet of Urdu. Urdu actually has a history. There is an interesting starting point which you may not get with many other literary traditions. He travelled from Deccan, from south. He was a great Dakkani poet, and he came to Delhi because Delhi was a center of patronage, and here he was told that your Dakkani will not do. And if you really want to become a big poet, then you should write in the poetry which has a prestige in Delhi, in the exalted circles of Delhi. It was being told to him that you should learn to write in Persian. But he didn't want to write completely in Persian, so he started writing in a language which was local. The speech was local, but imagery, words, situations, emotions, all of them were almost whole hog taken over from Persian. And then he is called Baba-e-Rekhta. He became the first big Wali Dakni, first big poet of Urdu. So a new poetry developed, which was a combination of three things. So the new literature, new poetry that developed, it was a combination of three things: Persian, Dakkani, and the local flavor, Delhi's speech. Delhi's speech formed the grammatical base. The nouns, adjectives came almost entirely from Persian. Themes, imageries came from Persian. Pronoun, conjunction, verbs, they came from the speech of Delhi. And it was very heavily inspired by Persian. And so Ghazal became the dominant template of this new poetry. Wali was the poet, first big Urdu poet. He was a poet of love. For him, there was just a single theme. You read a lot of Wali, it just comes back to the theme of love. And his poetry essentially celebrated love without any nuances. There were no nuances, but it was just a frank and open celebration of love. His representative line would be शगल बेहतर है इश्कबाजी का क्या हकीकी और क्या मजाजी का. If you are loving, if you love, it's good enough. It doesn't matter whether your love is this worldly or otherworldly, whether it's the love for God or love for another human being. It just doesn't matter, so long as you love. Love is the main trope. So Persian, Delhi, and love, they became the big themes around Urdu. How did it get its name? As I said, Urdu is a very unusual name. Around the 17th century, records have a very long name. Urdu, by the way, is a Turkish word, and it means camp, horde, just a camp, a resting place for a mobile group. The name for a language would be from since 17th century, a longish name, Zaban-e-Urdu-e-Mualla Shahjahanabad. What it means is the language of the exalted or the gentry of the camp of Shahjahanabad in Delhi. Now from there are shortened versions. Urdu-e-Mualla, Zaban-e-Urdu-e-Mualla Shahjahanabad. Urdu-e-Mualla is the camp of the gentry, of the exalted people, or Zaban-e-Urdu, the language of the camp. And gradually, by around 18th century, we find that all of it gets shortened to a shortest possible Urdu. So Urdu is no longer the name for a camp, it becomes the name for a language. There was a poet from Delhi, I think the first usage of the word Urdu for language is, this was a poet called Mushafi. He was a great admirer of Mir Taqi Mir, about whom I will talk about Atan and Sauda. So he wanted to pay his compliment to Mir and Sauda. So he said, Khuda rakhe zaba maine suni hai Mir o Mirza ki, Mir and Mirza Sauda. Kahe kis muh se hai Mushafi, Urdu hamari hai. Their Urdu is so great that I can't consider Urdu to be mine. Urdu really has found its true fulfillment with Mir and Sauda. And since then, Urdu became the standard template. There were other words which were being used. Hindi was one, Rekhta was the other. But from the beginning of the 19th century, Urdu then became the standard noun, standard word for this. Now, from love, from a very open celebration of love, there is a kind of a mutation or a kind of a reconfiguration that happens with Mir, what is his name? What is Mir Taqi Mir. Mir Taqi Mir has been considered the greatest poet of Urdu, at least the Urdu people. They don't consider Ghalib as the greatest, it's Mir. He is called Khuda-e-Sukhan, the god of poetry. And why is Mir great? I will explain. Mir is actually the Hegel of Urdu poetry. Mir is to Urdu poetry what Hegel is to modern Western philosophy. In the sense, or he is Newton of natural sciences before the arrival of Einstein. He actually creates a paradigm within which all this happens. Mir created a range of Urdu poetry which has not been transcended even today or expanded. It has not happened in the last 3 decades. Mir created the paradigm for poetry, for Urdu poetry, which others could extend, modify, turn upside down, which they did, but all within the paradigm. So that is the power of paradigm. So Mir created a paradigm within which all of this has happened. So people wrote very different kinds of poetry. In Lucknow, one variation of Mir went to Lucknow when people wrote one kind of poetry, another one in Delhi, another one in other places, but no new paradigm has been created. The frontiers, the glass ceiling has not been breached. The paradigm, the limits that he created, they have not been broken. Most poets and most later traditions, modernist tradition, progressive tradition, all these traditions, they have operated broadly within the paradigm that was set by me. And so quite rightly he's been considered the Khuda-e-Sukhan, the greatest ever, at least for this reason. Urdu, he in a way constructed a house or a big building, and Urdu still lives in that big building, which has many rooms, many by-lanes, many rooms, many halls, many plazas that were built by Mir. Some renovation has been done, but that house remains intact and not very much has been added to it. Little bit of renovation has been done, but not very much has been added to it. So what is this room and what is this building that Mir built? And that's what I think rest of my talk is going to be just a description of that building or the hall which was built by Mir, which remains broadly unaltered even today. Firstly, the first room in that big hall is that he gives a new twist to love. His love is not Wali's love. It's not a plain celebration of love. It's not an unnuanced celebration of love. Love is now equated with betrayal, torment, letting down, cruelty. Love is essentially a trauma. It's pain, it's suffering. The famous line in Mir's time used to be, "Kijiye kya Mir Sahab, bandgi bechargi." Love means a certain helplessness. You are a victim of your emotions, and if love can then be sublimated, if it's the world, then you are a victim of the world. So a kind of a victimology evolved around the theme or the trope of love. A new genre, vasokht. Vasokht is a kind of complaint. So when you talk about love, you are essentially complaining about something. You could be complaining about a person, you could be complaining about the world, you could be complaining to God, but all of this through the imagery of love. It was just the opposite of a Persian line. There is a Persian line by a famous Persian poet, Hafiz, 15th or 16th century. It's a very interesting line. It said, "Hej ashik sukhane sakh bamashuk na guft." What it means is that no lover has ever used an unkind word for the no. If you're a lover, then you would never use an unkind or a harsh word. That's the test of being a lover. You cannot. Now, if this was the template set by Persian, by Hafiz, Mir completely turned it upside down. because it was just what he wrote was just the opposite of it. It was nothing but complaint, trauma, pain, anguish, letting down, the cruelty. He creates a new template for the lover, for the ashik. What would be an example? Well, I have better examples, so slightly later down, but one example will do. होगा सितमो ज़ौर से तेरे ही कनाया, दो शख्स जहाँ शिकवाए अय्याम करेंगे. If in this big world, if there are two people sitting somewhere complaining about the world, then there is just one thing they are talking about. They are talking about your unkindness and the way you've been tormenting people. There is nothing else to be complaining about in this world. 200 years later, Faiz just repeated this line. You would have heard, कर रहा था गमे जहाँ का हिसाब, आज तुम याद बेहिसाब आए. It's actually just a turning around of the same thing that he said. And many others, but let me not go into it. He creates the second room. In the first room is love and a new meaning that he imparts to love. Love means being unfaithful, being cruel, being tormenting, being unkind and all that. And this could just not be the lover, but the whole world as a whole. Second was a slightly more complex idea. And this idea is, where do ideas come from? Where do poetry comes from? Where does literature come from? And the three stand answers then were, either it comes from within, your inner compulsions, or it comes from some transcendental root, from the God. God says things to others and through the poet. This was one standard trope those days. Mir gave a third one. And this was interesting. He wrote, मुझको शायर न कहो मीर की साहिब मैंने, दर्दो गम जितने किए जमा तो दीवान किया. My poetry is nothing but what the world has given me. All the dardo gham that I have accumulated as a result of what the world has given me, all that has been compiled into my poetry. I am not a poet. I am just a compiler of all the torment that exists in this world. Darhami hal ki hai sari mere diwan mein. My diwan has the restlessness of the entire world. The restlessness of the entire world has been compiled into my literature. तू भी कर सैर ये मजमुआ परेशानी का. You can also come and travel this compendium of pain. My book is just nothing but a compendium of pain. Now this line was so interesting that I am not a poet. I have just compiled all that has been given to me. This was repeated century after century after century. Almost 150 years later, Faiz Ahmad Faiz wrote, हम परवरिश लौह कलम करते रहेंगे, जो दिल पे गुजरती है रकम करते रहेंगे. All poetry that I write, it's what happens to me, what I experiences, what the world gives to me as my experiences, that is what I write out. The original idea had been given by me. Slightly later, Sahir Ludhianvi, the famous poet, he also wrote, दुनिया ने तजुर्बात व हवादिस की शक्ल में जो कुछ दिया था उसको ही लौटा रहा हूँ मैं. My experiences, calamities, all that the world which gave to me, I am just writing it down and I am giving it back to the world in the form of poetry. My poetry is a kind of a return gift to the world for what the world gave to me. And further down, there was a famous poet, Dushyant Kumar, who did not believe in this Urdu-Hindi dichotomy. So he wrote in Hindi, but he wrote Urdu ghazal, he wrote poetry. He wrote a beautiful line, मैं जिसे ओढ़ता बिछाता हूँ वो गज़ल आपको सुनाता हूँ. I need not translate this for you, but I think the original idea had been set by Mir when he said, मुझको शायर न कहो मीर की साहिब मैंने, दर्दो गम जितने किए जमा तो दीवान किया. Ghalib of course had a different take on it. For him, the ideas do come from the transcendent, though Ghalib was not much of a believer in the transcendent. His ghazal was, आते हैं गैब से ये मज़ामी ख़याल में. From the sky, these great ideas, They come from the sky, and when they come, Ghalib Sarir Khama Nawaye Sarush hai. Then the tip of my pen becomes the word of God. So what I write through the tip of my pen is actually the message that comes to me from up above there. The next room, or the third room in the building, was one which created openings for the progressives of the 20th century. It was, you couldn't imagine that somebody could write progressive poetry then. Pro-people poetry, yes, but progressivism and its outline, that progressive poetry could be written, but he did. He wrote, and progressives in both the possible senses, in the sense of rich and poor, but also in the sense of a view of the world. For instance, he wrote, "Na mil mi rab ke amiron se tu, हुए हैं गरीब उनकी दौलत से हम." Please do not meet the rich people. I am poor just because they are rich. So it's their richness that has made me poor. And if you see 200 years later, Sahir saying, "दौलत बढ़ी तो मुल्क में इफलास बढ़ गया." Sahir is trying to grapple with this problem, that why is it that whenever in a society wealth increases, poverty also increases. But then, this is precisely what Mir had said about 200 years before. शेर मेरे हैं सब खवास पसंद. I know that my poetry caters to the elite, because poetry then was an indulgence of the elite, of the rich, of the resourceful people, the feudals. There would be mushairas confined to a very small set of people. So he wrote, शेर मेरे हैं सब खवास पसंद, special people, खास लोगों के लिए, पर मुझे गुफ्तगू आवाम से है. But my concern is somehow with the common man. But my शेर, they do not reach there. More than that, all this became a kind of template for the progressive poetry that followed 2 centuries later. But I think he also wrote a poem on the transformation, on the transformative projects. And the one which is really, which I find very interesting is, "Ye daur to muwafiq hota nahi." This era, this age, it doesn't look that this era is going to be compatible with us. ये दौर तो मुवाफिक होता नहीं, मगर अब रखिए बिनाए ताज़ा इस चरख चंबरी की. Therefore you have to create a new foundation, बिनाए ताज़ा. This world cannot be altered, it cannot be mended, it cannot be improved. It's beyond redemption. Therefore, what to do? Therefore, you have to now create a new foundation. You have to lay a new foundation for a new world. And this was an idea which the really progressives lapped up in the 20th century, because this is what they wanted to say. And so when the 20th century Urdu poets, when they're looking for a suitable lineage, that lineage was not found in Ghalib, that they found in Mir. They went beyond Ghalib, further back to the 18th century. Also, when partition happened, and when the trauma of partition happened, the violence and the trauma, then again people went back to Mir, because Mir's poetry was about displacement, trauma, violence, distrust, hatreds. So much of the literary lineage for this kind of a situation could easily be found in Mir's poetry. Fourth room is on religion. And Mir created a new attitude on religion. It wouldn't be fair to call it secular, because it was not really secular, but it was very heretical, very anti-religious, and very harsh. And he was particularly harsh to Islam. He was also harsh to Hinduism and Christianity, but much less. The religion which was really in his shooting range, it was Islam. And I think so he heaped most of his contempt on Muslims and on Islam in a whole range of ways, in new ways, in creative ways. But he created the foundations for heretical poetry on religion. Let me give you some examples. The most common ones which you all know would be मीर के दीनों मजहब को तुम पूछते क्या हो, उनने तो कशका खींचा दैर में बैठा कब का तर्क इस्लाम किया. Why do you want to know about Mir's religion? Because he put a tilak and went and sat in the temple, and he gave up Islam a very long time back. This is common, but also हम न कहते थे कि मत बैरो हरम की चाल चल. I've been warning you not to follow the ways of Hinduism and Islam, temple and mosque. I've been warning you not to follow the ways of temple and mosque or Hinduism and Islam. अब ये दावा देर तक शेख और बरहमन में रहा. शेख और बरहमन, let them keep fighting each other, but I have been warning you, do not follow their ways. यारान दैर काबा दोनों बुला रहे हैं. I am standing here and I know that people, the defenders from Kaaba and that, from the temple and the mosque, from Islam and from Hinduism, they've both been calling out to me. They want my attention, they want my allegiance, but I don't know where I'll go. यारान दैर काबा दोनों बुला रहे हैं. अब देखें मीर अपना जाना किधर बने हैं. I'll decide where I want to go, but I know that both of them are calling me. Or more damaging, this was not so damaging. दरे काबा पे कुफ्र पढ़ता है मीर. And this is also ironical. Mir is speaking all heresies at Kaaba. Mir has gone to Kaaba and he is using this heretical language. Surely he cannot be a Muslim. He has to be someone else. दरे काबा पे कुफ्र पढ़ता है मीर. मुसलमान नहीं, वो कुहन गब है. He is the Zoroastrian religion, the fire worshipper, the Persian religion. He must be a follower of a Persian religion. He can't be a Muslim if he's using this language at the sacred place of Kaaba. और मीर भी दैर के लोगों ही किसी कहने लगा. Something has gone wrong with Mir. He's been talking like the people of the temple. He's been talking like the Hindus. What's gone wrong with Mir? He's now using the language of the Hindus. कुछ खुदा लगती भी कह लेता जो मुसलमान होता. He would have talked the truth, he would have talked a lot of sense if he was a Muslim. But the fact is that he's no longer a Muslim. So it's a kind of an irony. Also in comparison with Christianity, he probably would have known that in Christianity the bread and wine is part of the sacred rituals, and Mir was very tempted by this. So he took a taunt again on Islam and he said, मामूर शराबों से कबाबों से है सब दैर. दैर is a word which is used for non-Muslim places of worship. So sometimes it's used for Hindus temples, sometimes it's also used for the Christian church. This time in this it is used for the Christian church. So he says मामूर भरे हुए है. मामूर शराबों से कबाबों से है सब दैर. मस्जिद में है क्या शेख पयाला न निकाला. Why should I go to a masjid? There is nothing for me. Neither is there payala nor is there bread. So I don't want to go there. And there is one very significant taunt on Hinduism also. Hinduism is Buddhkada, the places where you find idols, images, temples. And his regret is that इस बुद्ध कदे में माना का किससे करें सवाल. I am searching for meaning. I want to discuss meanings, the meaning of life or whatever. I want to indulge with, discuss meanings, but where have I come? I have come to this Buddhkada, I have come to this temple where there are only idols. Who do I discuss meanings with? इस बुद्धकदे में माना का किससे करें सवाल. आदम बहुत हैं, सूरत बहुत हैं, सूरत आदम बहुत है. यहाँ आदम नहीं है. There is no human being. I want to talk to a human being, but this place only has images and idols. I can't discuss meanings with them. This place is useless for me. So in a way, he created this template of a very serious, very damaging, very disrespectful language on religion. Little later with Ghalib, I will not have the time to discuss Ghalib. It was much more moderated. Ghalib's language is much more restrained when it comes to religion. But Mir is really full of this kind of a taunt on religion. It was picked up later again by the progressives. So again, for this heretical language, people went back to Mir. The fourth or the fifth room in that big house, in the big building that was built by Mir, there is an abstract philosophy. There is a kind of universalism. There is a kind of a view of the world. And remember, all of this were to be expressed and compressed in 2 lines. That precondition was there. but he has written a lot on abstract philosophy, a view of the world. This was one thing, one theme which was developed to much greater heights by Ghalib, so much so that Ghalib was actually recognized as a poet philosopher, as a poet of philosophy, but much of it is also found in Mir in all kinds of ways. Let's say the relationship between the part and the whole, and where Mir's line is Juz martabai kul ko hasil kare hai aakhir. It is the destiny of the part to become the whole. Juz martabai kul ko hasil kare hai aakhir. एक कतरा ना देखा जो दरिया ना हुआ होगा. I have yet to come across a drop that did not become the ocean. The destiny of the drop is to become the ocean. The destiny of the part is to become the whole. And that's what I am looking at. The expanse of the world, and where he's saying, very small two lines, Sarsari tum jahan se guzre. You passed through the world in a great hurry. You just came and went. Sarsari tum jahan se guzre, varna har ja jahan digar tha. At every step, there was a world in the world. At every step, it was a different world altogether. It was a different universe altogether. But you came and went in such a hurry that you were not able to experience it, that you were not able to look at it. Ontology. On all this, Ghalib developed it further, but on ontology. इब्तिदा ही में मर गए सब यार, इश्क की कौन इंतहा लाया. There is a beginning of life, and then there is an end and culmination of life. Nobody knows what the end or culmination of life is, because we all die almost at the beginning. Ibtida is the beginning. Ibtida ही में सब मर गए सब यार. इश्क की कौन इंतहा लाया. Intiha is not a part of human experiences because nobody survives. So nobody survives to really experience the culmination or the ultimate point of this world. Nobody knows what the totality of this world is because nobody lives to experience that. You die in the first 2 minutes or first 3 minutes or 5% of it all. And the celebration of man, ultimate celebration of humans. Na sahel hame jano. Don't take us to be so easy. We are not easy. We are there, but we are not easy. Na sahel hame jano. Phirta hai falak sadiyon. The sky, for centuries and for centuries, it goes around and around and around. Tab खाक के पर्दे से इंसान निकलते हैं. And then humans are born from the layers of dust. We are very special people. We are not ordinary. It takes a long time for the cosmos to produce humans like us. खाक आदम है हर तमाम ज़मीन पाँव हम संभाल. Anyway, let's take that. Just last, my comment on the world. World is a factory of illusions. ये तवहुम का कारखाना है. ये तवहुम का कारखाना है, या वही है जो एतबार किया. Now this, the world is a factory of illusions. What is there? Whatever you believe is there. या वही है जो एतबार किया. Whatever you have come to believe, that has come to be there. It's there. All the beliefs, all of them are there. Of course, the fifth or the sixth room would have been Delhi. He wrote a lot about Delhi. His was an abstract poetry, but if there was one thing which was concrete about it, it was the city of Delhi. He wrote a lot about Delhi, compared it with Lucknow, where he spent some part of his life. If I were to speak more, or if I were to speak again, I would want to add 3 points. I am now stopping. First, of course, Ghalib was to Mir what Marx was to Hegel. Ghalib developed Mir. Ghalib turned Mir upside down, so he just wrote the opposite of Mir wrote, but he considered himself a great disciple of Mir, just like Marx considered himself to be a great disciple of Hegel. So he was to Mir what Marx was to Hegel. Ghalib was a poet of human predicament. He wrote a lot on human predicament. He had a very, very elaborate philosophical outlook. At some point, I wrote a whole article on philosophical dimensions of Khalid's poetry. And at the level of form, with Khalid, Urdu gets very, very Persianized. So Persianization of Urdu, excessive Persianization of Urdu happens not so much in Mir, but in Khalid. So in a way, Persian makes a much greater return, both at the level of imagery and at the level of language with Khalid. The second thing that I would have talked about was that there were subsequent trends in Urdu. Urdu developed. There was modern poetry of Hali. Hali was a modernist. There was patriotic poetry on Indian nationalism by Akbar Allahabadi. Iqbal, who was more like Lenin, he was a proselytizer. He wrote reformist poetry, but a great 20th century poetry, and the progressives. So if we have to see the channels or the directions into which mainstream Urdu flowed, because all of them were very heavily indebted to mainstream Urdu poetry. The imageries, the language, the forms, the meter, everything. So progressives, patriots, modernists, and also reformers, they all went back to this great resource that had been created by mainstream, by what I call mainstream Urdu poetry. They tried to break out of it. Progressives claimed to be the rebels. They were the rebels, and their rebellion was against the mainstream Urdu poetry, the ishq and love and all, ishq and alcohol, etc., that I didn't talk about. But even when they tried to rebel, they remained very much trapped within the parameters of mainstream Urdu poetry. They did not. So even when Faiz talked about revolution, he counterposed it with love, his famous line, मुझसे पहली सी मोहब्बत मेरे महबूब न मान. So these tropes or templates or whatever, they got so firmly entrenched in subsequent progressive poetry. Finally, Pakistan, the making of Pakistan was a great setback to this Urdu. It developed very, very differently in India and in Pakistan. So it also got partitioned, and this partitioning became very clear at the 1965 war between India and Pakistan, when you found Urdu poets fighting from both the sides. The Urdu poets of Pakistan, they heaped a lot of scorn on India, and the Urdu poets from India, Sardar Jafri and others, they wrote very, very, very anti-Pakistan poetry, almost sending a warning to Pakistan and so on. So it got completely divided. The same poetry, same language, same heritage, but the thoughts and ideas that they expressed were very, very different. Urdu had taken great pride in its cosmopolitanism and its being context neutral. The whole thing about mainstream Urdu poetry was that it was not dependent on a context. It was completely liberated from context. It was completely context neutral. But I think eventually context did catch up with it. It did come down, and it did get completely overshadowed by the context, either the context of partition or the context of India and Pakistan and so on. I think I'll stop here, and then maybe we can, when there is discussion, then we can take up this. Thanks.
Thank you, Salil. I think it was a very good talk. And I think a few very relevant ideas and concepts have come across. I just talked about 2-3 things which I thought were very relevant for me, listening to this talk. Especially because I come from literature, so I thought this was so interesting to know that literature, Urdu formed, it is Urdu literature which forms the linguistic community of Urdu. I think this is something which is amazing. I don't think any other language or literature has done that. Something which is really unique. That we have a literature which leads to a kind of language, which leads to the development of the language. I think the other thing which I thought was very interesting was that there are finite images, finite metaphors and proofs, and they become infinite. And I completely agree with you. I think even in progressive literature, it is these very finite, words that are coming from classical Urdu literature, which have acquired infinite meanings, and these metaphors, I think they have developed very well. And then this whole idea about repetition and tradition and continuity and change, which leads to a kind of a transformation. Of course, what Professor Misra has talked about in the context of me, I think is very important, because mostly, I think generally people think that Ghalib is the great 19th century poet. I think ideas around me, one doesn't talk about him so much. So I thought that was very interesting. I had, one thing which I wanted to add was, I was just thinking, especially when I was listening to what you're talking about in the context of me. Wouldn't we say that Urdu as a language and Urdu poetry begins with, say, the Sufi tradition? Yeah, for instance, Amir Khusro and the Sufi tradition. We start, Amir Khusro is called the Tote-e-Hind. Yeah, and he's the one who starts with Rekha and works with Khadi Boli and starts, writing in this tradition. And also because, when I was listening to, when you were talking about me and when you came to the third or the fourth room, and you were talking about, he's talking about non-believing in religion. And he's talking about, I can belong here and I can belong there.
Right.
And this is also the time when in Punjab we are witnessing the uprising of the Sufi poets like Bulleh Shah and others. And prior to that, we have had a Sufi tradition. I think the Sufi tradition comes from Persia and 11th, 12th century, and then it is spreading, and then Amir Khusro starts with it. So I was thinking maybe one can also trace, this is just like a thought that came to my mind, that we can trace lot of thinking that Mir is talking about, even to the Sufi tradition. And this is also my question, but I think I'll keep this for later. And we can open the floor for other questions. I think the talk must have generated a lot of thought and thinking in us. So, in case anybody has comments or observations.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you, Salil. That was very...
Sorry? And then Nitika, yeah.
Okay. So, I am somebody who is totally unaware and ignorant about this issue. But through the cinema, of course, I have been introduced to some of the topics in clear ways. And while listening to you, what I was thinking was the charm of Urdu, apart from being context neutral, I feel it is also very amazing how in things that contemporaneity, it can fit in any time period, sort of. The ability to express actually very contemporaneous in that sense. So even though we have a tendency to see Urdu as a language which was in the past, because I think very few people would be using Urdu nowadays, composing literature, particularly in India. But there are, of course, groups and people who are really die-hard fans of Urdu, like yourself, are continuing that. So I was just wondering, since you also said that it was not born in any geographical space, it was not community-centric or in any such kind of a space that would identify languages with regions and places. I was thinking over this period of this journey, has it ever managed to influence like local cultures or local traditions or get influenced wherever it went and changing somewhere the way it is practiced? So that is what was coming into my mind.
Yeah.
This momentum.
Good question, we need to think about it. Let me just repeat your question for those who are listening to it online. Given that this is a somewhat unusual, atypical literary tradition that I'm talking about, but it seems to be so widespread. So in its own time, or any particular given time, what is the nature of its dialogue, encounters with local cultures, local societies? Is it influenced by local practices, local forms, and does it influence them, and so on? The interesting thing is that normally one would find this happening if in any place Urdu may not have had its own specific region, but it flourished in a particular region where people read it and so on. One would find there to be a kind of an encounter or a dialogue between local cultures, local ways of doing things, and literature. In that case, the surprising thing about Urdu is not that it was there, but there was very little of it. For some reason, the excellence and the great heights that Urdu enjoyed also came with a certain insularity. It is till modern period, till Bombay cinema takes over, it's also a somewhat insular tradition in that sense that the number of poets is reasonably small, and before print takes over, the places where the matters of Urdu are being decided are mushairas. Mushairas are not like common assemblies. Mushairas are also fairly specialized gatherings of people where experts sit and then they decide who is the greater poet of the times, who is the greatest poet of the times. There is a considerable patronage system which Urdu enjoyed, and when the patronage system began to get depleted, it also affected Urdu. So it is a very strange tradition, which of course there is a dialogue, but the surprising thing is not that there was a dialogue with the local. The surprising thing is that there wasn't so much. It was much more insular. That insularity broke down only with Bombay cinema. Before that, it retained its ivory tower kind of status, and so insular, ivory tower, exalted. Not too much of an encounter with local cultures, local literatures, other literatures did not.
We have two questions here. One,
someone is online.
Nitika, I thought there was
okay.
Rachna and Nitika,
Just-
but whatever. Whoever.
Yeah, sir, my question was, am I audible?
Yes, Nitika.
So, firstly, that when you said we wrote something anti-religious, but what ma'am just mentioned, the Sufi mankabat.
Yeah.
We also wrote multiple mankabat, which were, a religious or maybe some types, but mostly it was promoting Islam and Sufism in particular. So, कहीं पे I have read that हालात के हवाले के अनुसार लिखा जाता है, उर्दू में जब लिखा जाता है. Firstly, your take on that. Also, since हम partition और आपने बॉम्बे सिनेमा के साथ इमर्जेंस ऑफ उर्दू एंड इट्स ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन की बात की है, तो सेकेंडली नज़्म जो है वो हमें लेट 19th century, 20th century और 21st century में ज़्यादा इमर्ज होती है, क्योंकि गज़ल के अंदर एक बहुत डेलिकेट और नज़ाकत की बात आती है, जबकि नज़्म हार्श हो सकती है. जैसे हम साहिल रज़ियानी का एग्जाम्पल लें तो उन्होंने तसव्वुरात की परछाइयाँ करनी हैं, या इंसान की औलाद से इंसान बनेगा, बहुत सी ऐसी चीज़ें लिखी हैं जो पॉलिटिकली बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग ओपिनियन को पोर्ट्रे करती है, और वो नज़्म की शक्ल में लिखी है. तो नज़्म का बढ़ना 19वीं सदी के बाद और उससे पहले उर्दू का हवाला बहुत बड़ा होना, इसका कारण या इसका ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन.
But there's also Rachna. Maybe Rachna, you can make your point.
Yeah, sir, just an addition to what has been asked regarding the Sufi tradition, I also want to know what about like Kabir and all who came up with the lyrical tradition of again stylic worship. So if you're thinking that this kind of idea is one of the most
Yeah.
developed in the worship,
Yeah.
ideas there.
Yes. Yeah. Shall I answer them? Okay, the question, Nitika had two questions. First, of course, is that I portrayed Mir as someone who was opposed to religion or someone who had a heretical view on religion. But if he was connected with the Sufi tradition, and so he would have had a kind of an ambivalent relationship with religion. He could not have been completely anti-religious. Maybe Nitika he was not, but much of his poetry certainly is. And there is a sense in which Sufi tradition is also anti-formal religion, anti-doctrinalism, anti-scripturalism. So somehow these things fit in. The Sufi perspective of anti-formal religions, and Mir also who is opposed to religion. So I don't think they would be opposite to each other. Nazm, yes, of course. Nazm is normal kind of poetry which you would find in other literary traditions also. Nazm became much more dominant in the 20th century, little bit in the 19th century with the moderns. Nazm is around a theme, it has a narrative structure, it has a story, it has something to say, it can make a political point. Obviously, ghazal was found to be very, very limited and very, very limiting. You could express certain thoughts in ghazal, but not very much. And I think it was found that for modern life, for politics, for ideology, etc., Nazm was a suitable medium, much more suitable medium than ghazal was. And so a lot of the poets from Hali onwards, Hali, Iqbal, Faiz, they wrote ghazal, but they shifted in a very big way to Nazm, because it was through Nazm that they could say all that they wanted to say. Rachna, Kabir, I think this ties up with the point that Diamond made. Of course, connectivities can be found. Mir's connectivity can be found with Amir Khusro, with Kabir, with the Dakhni tradition, with the Gujari tradition. Of course, in a broad, if literature or poetry is a large ocean, then I think connecting threads can be found, and they are definitely there. But what I am doing is that I am trying to look at the novelty or the newness of it. And that newness and novelty happens, that breakthrough happens much in the 19th century with Wali Dakhni, but in a very big way with Mir. Of course, when the newness happened, the linkages with the old are always there. So linkages can always be found with Kabir, because they are both attacking an orthodoxy, with Bhakti tradition, with Sufi tradition, also with Amir Khusro. But I think what is interesting about this Urdu is not so much its linkages, its prehistory, its connections with earlier literary traditions, but its novelty, its newness, its breakthrough. So that breakthrough is made in the 18th century, as I am arguing, and much later when people claimed to make a big breakthrough, the progressives for that matter, it was not so much of a breakthrough, because they were actually responding to the classical is a better word, Urdu poetry, mainstream Urdu poetry, or to the kind of rich imagery, that had been created by this tradition. So my plea would be for a novelty, newness, intervention, breakthrough in the 18th century, and continuity thereafter. That's how I would look upon it. But of course there can be alternative ways of defining this relationship of Urdu with Dakhni, with Gujari, with Kabir, with Amir Khusro, and so on. There would be linkages.
We have a question here. There is a name also.
Sir, not a question. I was Anil.
Yeah, I'm after.
Yeah, Ayush.
Okay. So, I am Ayush, MA History first year. Sir, not a question. I was just asking. I was just curious about the progressive writers movement and the progressivism that came in Urdu poetry. Can it be replicated again? And what was it that constituted its uniqueness in the era of 1930s and 40s that it was? क्योंकि उसके बारे में बहुत ज़्यादा पता नहीं है सर. In general, what would be a good starting point to learn about?
There is a very nice book by Rakshanda Jalil on progressive Urdu poetry. There would be things that it shares, progressive period shares with other traditions, but in Urdu it was particularly marked. In the 1930s, some people got together and they felt that we need to write a different kind of literature. The rebellion was against the classical mainstream Urdu poetry, which was apolitical, which did not have context, which was insular, which only talked about feudal values, which talked about love and alcohol and all that. And they felt that the time is there, has come to write social poetry, progressive poetry, poetry in which there are real people, peasants and workers, not cardboard characters which dotted the Urdu poetry. This happened in the 30s, and I think the breakthrough was very, very marked in other languages also, but in Urdu particularly. Faiz is the big progressive poet, Majaz is another one, Sardar Jafri, Sahir Ludhianvi. My point here is that even when Urdu claimed to make a break from the classical mainstream poetry, but it could not make a breakthrough. It was like a child rebelling against the father, and when the child rebels against the father, child reproduces much of the father. So progressive Urdu poetry actually reproduced much of the classical and mainstream Urdu poetry while actually trying to rebel against it. And so all their tropes on love, on change, on revolution, on transformation, all those came back, some from Ghalib, some from Mir, and so on. So instead of a break, I see a kind of a connectivity between the progressive intervention of the 1930s with the classical and mainstream Urdu poetry.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking about this argument that you make about insularity, that it is insular, and I was just thinking about the mainstreaming of Urdu itself. So, like we were discussing that Hakala's article where he's talking coffee houses in the 18th century, and where Mir is complaining like it is becoming a Rosemarra, that it's kind of a language of daily expression. So not across like different linguistic contexts, but say different social contexts. So for example, Rekhti, like vulgar women's poetry, which is coming and so on. So how does then like this idea of insularity then stand when we can actually see that it is permeating like different kinds of compositions and different kinds. So it's not necessarily the language of a patronized language which is only in a certain kind of context. There are those different social levels at which it is it's kind of like going around. So is it, and it's happening in the 18th century and not necessarily
the idea of insularity was a very clear aspiration.
Okay.
It was a club poetry. It was a poetry of a certain group, a club. Suniti Kumar Chatterjee calls it garden poetry. It's not a jungle poetry which grows on its own. It's a garden poetry which is very cultivated, which has rules, regulations, which words to use, which thoughts to express, which expressions. So all that, so very much a disciplined kind of a poetry. With that comes a certain insularity. Now the thing about insularity is that no insularity can really be complete. The time that I am talking about, in that time there are a whole number of poets who are writing in Urdu. Jafar Zakalli is one who's writing ridiculous poetry, but it's writing in Urdu. There are people outside Delhi who are writing, but they are not getting the kind of recognition which a club poet, which a poetry which is confined to a certain club.
But there is an audience to that poetry as well.
There is an audience to that poetry. You see, this is not a democratic time. This is not a poetry which is very dependent upon the audience. Their audience is a small little group. They need a patronage system more than the audience. It's also before the print. So it's not a question that bothers them very much. This is a very Brahminical phase of Urdu poetry. It's not a proselytizing phase. They are not trying to popularize Urdu. They are trying to restrict its entry. A famous modern poet, Hali, he complained that he was not being considered an Urdu poet because he was not from Delhi. Urdu was considered to be a language of Delhi. So he wrote, and Hali is one of the biggest that we have, शायर को है यह लाजिम कि वो हो अहले ज़बान से हो गैर ज़बान छू न गई उसके दहन को, उसके मुंह को गैर ज़बान ना छू गई. मालूम है हाली का जो है मौलिद मंशा, you know where Hali comes from? पानीपत, just 150 kilometers, 100 kilometers from Delhi. उर्दू से भला वास्ता हजरत के वतन को, उर्दू के धनी वो हैं जो दिल्ली के हैं रोड़े, पंजाब से मस उनको ना पूरब ना दक्कन को, बुलबुल को ही मालूम है अंदाज चमन के, क्या आलम गुलशन की खबर जागो जगन को। चील कौवों को आलम गुलशन का क्या पता होता है, वो तो जो बहुत बड़ा गुलशन है जिसकी की बड़ी exalted birds हैं, only they are familiar with the intricacies of this world of Urdu, others are not. This is his taunt. He's taunting against it because living in Panipat, he's not considered poet enough by these exalted Delhi people. So they are trying to maintain an insularity. They may not be fully successful.
Is it a case of competitive insularity then? Like Persian against Urdu and then Urdu against?
Absolutely. But insularity is the big word, not democratization. They are not trying to reach out. They are not interested in an audience. Their audience is that small group. They must write excellent poetry, great poetry, and they are not into reaching out to people. That continue to be written.
There's a question there and there is another
Sanjay.
question. Yes. Tell us your name and please.
Sorry?
Slight correction, because you mentioned as a phrase, and is the famous poetry, very much respect is form, but very good remark. Mere is a term that was used in the song that was sung by Nusrat. And in fact, when you read Faiz, you don't use mere, you use Meri, and Faiz in fact is one of the first Urdu poets who uses a feminine term. So, and connected with this is also the question that I'm going to ask, because when you look at the Arabic Persian poetry, the whole tradition of it, you see that there is a sort of homoerotic angle to it, which get lost somehow when you come to maybe in the 20th century. And this is not, this is again switching from poetry to prose. You see that the half is written somewhere around the 30s, 40s, right?
Yeah.
It's mentioned there.
Yeah.
And the kind of reaction that we get to, to the whole story itself. When we say that Urdu is in most of the circles, I find it quite interesting that people are saying that Urdu is a very cosmopolitan language. It encompasses a lot of things in itself. But at the same time, it also is, as you rightly mentioned, is also trying to reserve itself. It's not really quotidian in that sense. So be it the issues of maybe gender or other issues like caste, they do not get reflected in poetry as much as we would like them to be. Maybe a kind of progressive shift that we talked about. I don't know whether that also talks about, that also mentions these things in the poetry itself.
Too many questions, but let me just pick up 2 or 3. On the first one, there is a very nice booklet by Firaq Gorakhpuri, Urdu ki Ishqiya Shairi, where the big debate is taken up. The gender neutral expressions, the mere and the meri, and in most of the Urdu, before Faiz, before progressives took over, they did not use expressions gender indicative, so mera maashook aata hai, mera maashook aaya. It went on for a long time. Even in Bombay cinema, you have words like baharu phool barsao, mera mehboob aaya hai. This is a carryover from the 18th, 19th century. Why is this so? There are 2 explanations. One, of course, is what you just gave, that there is this is indicative of a homosexual preference. The other is that it's simply asexual. It could be from any lover to any lover. So if you say mera mehboob, it could be man for the woman, but also woman for the man, also man for the man. So it's simply a gender neutral term, whether a general preferred term. So there are these 2 dominant arguments, positions on this, but the whole debate on what is the relevance of this use of gender neutral expressions, it's very nicely there in a small booklet by Firaq Gorakhpuri.
What is the name?
Urdu ki Ishqiya Shairi, where he takes up the latter position. He says that there is nothing homosexual about it, although there is a great tradition, but it's simply a gender neutral terminology. The second, of course, cosmopolitanism and insularity actually go together. Because it's cosmopolitan, therefore it is insular. So it's not one versus the other. And that also explains why many of the social questions pertaining to caste or whatever, they don't find an entry into it. They did not find an entry into it precisely because of its self-maintained insularity, and self-maintained cosmopolitanism of the Urdu poetry, in which the issues of common people, etc., are not the preferred themes. Preferred themes are abstract philosophy, love, etc. So even people, they come into it, but they come into mainstream Urdu poetry or the classical Urdu poetry in a very impersonal kind of way, not as concrete people of flesh and blood. That does not happen, but that's precisely because of the self-maintained insularity and cosmopolitanism. So it's not because, in spite of that, it's because of that. Because it's insular, therefore it's questions of caste and gender and others do not come into it.
Sanjay.
Yeah.
On the same theme, something related as well. The little I know, Urdu was a camp language, as you said, the word itself says that. And Persian was the language of literature, classical language, and became the official language during Roman times. But like Sanskrit, in soldiers' camps or otherwise, people use a mixed language, and which is what one is given to understand. I mean, that was Rekta, that was Urdu. So could it be that given the kind of patronage which was required, this cosmopolitanism, the fact that when you move towards more formal ways of writing, literary and so on, with patronage in the late Mughal period, from the East and so on, in some ways your insularity defines you. वो बाजार की भाषा जो है वो बाजार वालों के लिए आप नहीं लिखेंगे. You will have boundaries, and in that sense elitism is what defines you, and it often happens when languages move from oral traditions to formal and print traditions. So that way it's a common process, but in the case of Urdu it seems that they sought to retain it like that. And so much perhaps had to do with patronage in Delhi. But then I would also like to know that, see, Mir was born in 1723. This is his 300th year, and he died in 1822. So he lived through a time where we saw the decline of Mughal Empire, and he probably had memories of Nadir Shah's invasion Delhi, 1839. So much so that his patronage here thins and it vanishes, and he goes to Lucknow. And apparently the anecdotal evidence is that he didn't open his mouth throughout there because he thought, in Delhi ki zaman mein se kharab ho jayegi, Lucknow ja. So there was this elitism was also reinforced by the fact of the centrality of Delhi and of the Mughals. And in many ways, perhaps in the long run, I want to ask you, this canonical position that Mir has, and the classical position, you also seem to be suggesting that virtually everything can be traced back to Mir. But that's a very, that's because it's kind of Mughal elite, it's Delhi, and therefore what people did at the margins would not be something, with profound expression, also because of this garden party, this garden club, which is exclusionary in many other ways. And I think it somewhere, I mean, people must have broken out of this paradigm. Maybe that's not recognized. They did.
Of course, he wrote a lot on some of the more concrete poetry that Mir wrote was on this destruction. He uses words like Sikh Maratte in one of them. Chor uchakke Sikh Maratte Shahugara Zarkhaha hai. But then the second line is important. चैन से हैं जो कुछ नहीं रखते, फ़क्र है जिनकी दौलत है. Fakiri, renunciation, if that is your wealth, then you're all right. Because he saw so much of destruction. So he wrote a lot on Delhi's destruction, destruction of the kings, destruction of the rulers, destruction of a patronage system. So that's very much that's a very significant part of Delhi's Mir's poetry of destruction, poetry of loss. The one very nice one is, this is the one which is not a two-liner, it's called a kata because the meaning spills over into the next one. I was walking on the road and I hit upon a human skull, and the human skull was almost broken, but the moment I stepped on it, the human skull said, and now I'll recite, कल पाँव एक कासरे सर पर जो आ गया, यकसर वो उस्तखान शिकस्तों से चूर था, कहने लगा कि देख कर रख पाऊँ बेखबर, मैं भी कभू किसू का सरे पुरगुरूर था. I was the exalted, proud head of someone just the other day. Don't stand, don't trample me, don't walk on my head. I am not just a skull. I was a proud head of someone. So much of Mir's poetry is actually a commentary, a sad commentary on this kind of destruction.
But of
Shahan,
Delhi.
eh?
Delhi.
Of Delhi, he lived in Delhi.
Yeah.
Yes.
Share
Yes.
show of share is Delhi.
Yes, very much. Most of Shahra Show is actually Delhi. Much later, it's
decline of Delhi.
yes. शाह की कोहले जवाहर थी खाके पा जिनकी, जिनके पैरों की धूल बड़े बड़े राजाओं की आंख का सुरमा होती थी, उन्हीं की आंख में फिरती सलाइयाँ देखी. He was probably referring to the Mughal ruler who had been blinded by the Rohillas. They have now been blinded. So I think there is much of that. It is an exalted world, Sanjay. I am not saying that there are that nobody else, people are sitting quietly and not producing poetry. Obviously, all the big things are replicated by people in their own ways. Whether they are recognized or not is a different point. People are trying to see, they might have been trying to seek entry into this very exalted insular world, but it was not easy. It was completely a nice, guarded, protected medieval fortress. You can do all kinds of things outside, but the fortress retains its aura, monumentality, charm, heights, etc. That Urdu retained for a very, very long time. It could not. Urdu eventually had to break out of it. Surprising thing is not that. Surprising thing is how long it was able to retain this exclusion, insularity, and this aura well into the print. Then, of course, once print arrives, then it cannot. Then obviously it gets popularized and democratized. But Urdu is a fairly successful story of holding on against against pressures of print, democratization, popular attempts to get into this exalted world of Urdu.
Do we get one small thing? Do we get, since he lived through this
Sorry?
decline, since he lived through this decline, as well as he saw the advent of East India Company rule, do we have in his poetry something about them as well later on?
No, I don't think. Again, the context neutrality is nicely maintained. So it's not about people, it's not about what's happening. It's about situations, emotions, responses, experiences. It's not about blood and flesh.
I think in Ghalib,
Huh?
in Ghalib,
In Ghalib there.
Ghalib you have a
Ghalib,
In
you have this
Ghalib.
whole
You have more of that.
Yes.
the loss of an era, nostalgia.
Very
In
much.
Ghalib you have.
Very
I think it's the
No,
first
also you have about British rule, about
British
others.
rule, what it has done.
Yeah, that of
I
course.
think Ghalib's poetry is not context neutral in that sense.
Poetry still is, but he also wrote a lot of prose. He wrote Dastambu, he wrote love letters, he wrote all of them, in which there is a lot of context, contemporary times. Sir Syed Ahmad wanted Ghalib to write the introduction of, he wanted to reprint Aine Akbari, and he gave it to Ghalib, and Ghalib agreed to write. But then he said, what nonsense, why should people read this? Why should people read Aine Akbari? If you really want to read the constitution, read it of these British. They are the wonderful people. They can produce fire. वो तिनके से आग बना देते हैं, वो भाप से जहाज चला देते हैं. Don't go back. Why read about this? Why read about 16th, 17th century? Be a man of the future. Look at the wonderful things which the new rulers are doing. So if you want to read the constitution, read the Ain of our current rulers. So he had an eye on what was happening in his times. He appreciated the fact that rulers can change without any violence. You know, one viceroy comes, goes, another one comes, and there is no turmoil or turbulence. He knew the kind of turbulence which would happen when one ruler was replaced by another ruler. So Khalid is much, in his prose, in his observations, he's much more contextual and about the times. But in poetry, he retains this insularity, social insularity, context neutrality.
Okay, we can take one last question if anybody has.
Just a comment, actually, not a question. So, is this insularity because of the nature of the form of the poetry?
It could be
Because
because
that's how I think people from literature would argue. Poetry is not a sociological product, it's also the structure that defines it. So, the insularity, therefore, probably, I'm not arguing, and if
But people are kind of like when the Rekhti poets, they are experimenting with forms also. They're writing shorter and very experimental kind of things.
And lot of Rekhti poetry is written by
men.
Men.
In
In
the voice of
the
women.
voice of
In the
women,
voice of
right.
women.
In the voice of women.
You know, as looking at it, as Persian began to decline, it lost its official status, and gradually it also lost the kind of patronage which was assigned with Persian. Then Urdu in a way becomes, in one case it becomes an alternative to Persian, in another sense it becomes a substitute to Persian. It also becomes the Persian, and that's why that's the time when Urdu becomes very heavily Persianized. So somewhere the insularity is also built into this project. It's a carryover from an earlier Persian tradition. Persian tradition, even when there were many poets under Akbar and so on, but it was still not the language or poetry of the people, and or the poetry that became very popular. That poetry that became popular would be Gujri and Dehalvi and so on. But Persian retained its exalted status, and I suppose with the decline that would have passed on to Urdu, which became the carrier of this exalted ivory tower status.
I don't know really, but I think Shairi, even at the time when Zog and Lead and all of them were writing, I think Shairi was still existing.
Yes.
And I think that kind of Shairi, these very short couplets, I think they were like everywhere. They were passed on everywhere. I think that is what is breaking also the insularity.
I'm sure.
I think people like Nazir Akbarabadi,
Yes.
who's writing in a very different kind of a tradition. So I think there are parallel
Definitely.
that are
Nazir is not a part of any patronage system, but his poetry was very popular. Jafar Zatali was there. His poetry was also, but it was popular, but it was considered very crude. So there are these parallel traditions. But I'm sure Khalid's poetry, etc., would reach people, and people will respond to it. But the club maintains itself. It happens even today.
There's one question and I also have
Not a question again, like adding to this, it's just a comment. Even I feel the courtesans, because they were also writing poems, they were singing, and I feel like even the fact that they must have taken up some poetry from these
Very much.
exalted shires and
Very much.
poets, तो वो भी popularize करने में या फिर
But why would that popularize it? These assemblies were not like cinema halls of today. These assemblies were very exalted sites where not everybody could be allowed to go. So in a way, the fact that courtesans took up this, that I don't think would have done much to democratize or popularize it. It would still be the charmed circle and the charmed elite cosmopolitan ivory tower circle. But you're right, courtesans they did reproduce and replicate the poetry of these big poets. Yeah.
This last question I'm asking is all these people, what is their social background? Did they also belong to elite kind of background?
They all lived on a
and all that.
patronage. They lived on a patronage system. They didn't work.
Paid
They
well
could-
and all that.
they
They're all rich.
They lamented, Mir lamented the loss of income, etc. Ghalib lamented, but they came from that class. They couldn't. Ghalib was offered a professorship in Delhi College, and he went and returned because he said it would be a loss of status if he was not received well. So they expected, they came from that kind of a background. Many of them came from a warrior background. Sahib-e-Saif, men of sword. So there were these two. In the Muslims, Sahib-e-Saif and Sahib-e-Qalam, men of the pen and men of the sword. So many of them came from that background, but they expected to be looked after by the system. They were not expected to work. They would not work. They would rather starve. So Ghalib had no money, and normally he should have accepted this professorship, but he didn't because it meant a loss of status. Sorry?
Sorry, respectfully disagree with what you said regarding the gender issue.
Regarding the gender issue?
Yeah, you said that these are not specifically homoerotic, but maybe gender neutral.
No, that's not I said. I said there are two positions on it. One position is that this is an expression of homosexual love. The other is that it's just a gender neutral expression. These are the two positions. And I really do not know by what kind of criteria or evidence can one decide whether it's one or the other. I don't know.
Just one couplet. This is from Urdu, it's a 17th century Urdu poet, and he writes, जबकि ऐसा हो गुंडमी लौंडा तो गुनाह गर क्यों न हो अदम. दूसरा है, गए घर से जो हम अपने सवेरे सरमुल्ला खान के डेरे वहाँ देखे कई तिफ्ल ए परीरो अरे रे अरे रे अरे रे. This is from Misra. The other one is गर्जे सब खूब रोहे खूब वली कत्ल करती है मिर्जा अदा.
Yes, of course. No, from Amir Khusro onwards, not even 17th century. In Amir Khusro, there would be poetry about this beautiful boy and his lips, and I wanted to ask for a. It's there since the 13th century.
Labeling it, kabhi it's
My question is, one is not saying that it's this or that. I am saying that there are this kind of poetry is very clear. There is no ambiguity. But in many of them, when you say "Mera Mashook aaya hai," "Mera Mehboob aaya hai," is there a possibility that it's simply a gender neutral expression? Do we rule out that possibility completely, or do we recognize that it would have been both? And there is no way. How does one decide this question? The examples that you are quoting, those are very clear. So we don't need to debate those. And those examples are there from Amir Khusro onwards. Hindu bacha bhi ki ajab husn dhare chhe. This is a rekhta because one line is Persian and one line is almost Braj, not even Khadi Boli. That the Hindu boy is so beautiful. Hindu bacha bhi ki ajab husn dhare chhe, bar waqt sukhan guftan mukh phool jhare chhe. Again Persian, and when he talks, phool jhare chhe. Guftan se labo laal utogi ab bosa bagiram. Only thing that I said was that I asked this little boy for a kiss. And Gufta ki Are Ram Turak kai kare che, but he started shouting, what is this Turak doing? Now, there is no ambiguity about what this means. This poetry is there from 13th century onwards. Can all such expressions which are gender neutral, Mera Mashook aaya hai, gaya hai, can they all be subsumed under this category? Or would it simply have been an expression of gender neutral? And I think it would be both. That's what I'm saying. I think we should. I'm not tired, but I think we should.
No, if you're not very
No, I think it's what it's
Thank you. I think it was a wonderful talk, and we all enjoyed also. And I thought how much poetry you know. It was like quite amazing.